Welcome to the Stone Date Podcast. I'm your host, Wes Ranson, and today we'll be talking about Philip II of Macedonia. He is most known today as being the father of Alexander the Great, but Philip was great in his own right. He did a lot to pave the way and mold the ambitions of Alexander, and without him, Alexander would have had a hell of a time to achieve what he did. It would probably have been truly impossible. But before we start talking about antiquity, let's get high. So tonight, I'm going to be smoking, I have Tumble pre-roll. It's from a brand called Timeless. All right, so Timeless, I found Timeless vapes. I believe Timeless makes a lot of different things. I couldn't really find everything they offer, but again, I found this Timeless vapes. They have a lot of vapes, and they have these infused pre-rolls. They have them sativa and indica, and the strain I'm smoking tonight is going to be Sour Diesel Infused Travelers. And if you open up, it's got a little tin container. It says Tumble on it, but the brand is Timeless. So I guess Tumble is just like a branch of Timeless. And there are 3 half-gram infused joints in here. Now, they don't have the keef on the outside of them. I believe they're still keef infused, possibly. I'm not sure about the diamonds or whatever. Maybe it'll say that in the description. But looking on Weed Maps here, it has the little meters. Happy is the most. Uplifted, so happy is like all the way on the meter. Uplifted is about 3/4 of the way, and relaxed is probably a little bit past halfway. And what it says about the strain is Sour Diesel is a classic with its unmistakable fuel-heavy aroma, layered with herbal spice and a touch of citrus. Caryophyllene, myrcene, and limonene dominate the terpene profile, creating a sharp and tangy flavor that keeps it bold from start to finish. And the flavors are diesel, lemon, and citrus. And it looks like the pack that I have today is going to be 40.28% THC. And that's what we're going to be smoking on. So I'm going to grab one out of this little tin pack. The tin is a little hard to open. You're going to definitely need to use 2 hands on that, or at least I did. But yeah, leave me a comment or send an email and let me know what you're smoking when you listen to the show. Yeah, definitely taste the cassie and the citrus. All right, Philip II of Macedonia. Philip claimed to be akin to Hercules, a lineage of royal blood derived from the gods, and this was very common in the ancient world. He sat amongst his barons wearing the same clothes, simple and homespun by his wife. When hearing cases by common subjects or discussions with his barons in the assembly, Philip was called by his name without any title. He would be called Philippos Aminton Macedonius, or simply Philippos Macedonios, but never king. He often engaged with his men in public wrestling contests. He never described himself as king in any official documents or public statements. Father of Alexander the Great, Philip was the unifier of Greece, author of Greece's first federal constitution, creator of the first national state of Europe, the first general of the Greek imperial age, founder of Europe's first great land empire, making him one of the prominent statesmen of the ancient world. Philip saved Macedonia from disintegration and military occupation. He secured Macedonia against external enemies by bringing together Europe's first national territorial state. And this was an entirely new form of political organization in the West. He developed mining, agriculture, urbanization, trade, commerce, and Greek culture. He transformed a semi-feudal tribal pastoral society into a centralized national state governed by a powerful monarchy and protected by a modern army, doubled the size of Macedonia, and incorporated much of the Balkans in the Macedonian state. Philip used diplomacy, bribery, intimidation, deceit, subversion, sabotage, assassination, marriage, betrayal, and war to reach his goals, which were the same means used by his contemporaries. He was a rare military man who saw the political and cultural world around him changing, and by mastering this change, he could reshape the future for himself and his people. Had there been no Philip, the exploits of his son would not have been possible. He provided the means, methods, and motives that lay behind Alexander's achievements. Culturally, Greeks in Philip's day regarded Macedonia as a remote, undeveloped area that remained unaffected by current events, progress, or development. This geographic backwater was inhabited by untrustworthy barbarians who spoke an uncouth form of Greek, governed by primitive political institutions, subscribed to customs, social values, and sexual practices that bordered on the unspeakably depraved, dressed in bear pelts, drank wine neat, and were given to regular bouts of incest, murder, and regicide. And regicide, by the way, I did not know, is the killing of a king. Where the Greeks regarded the city-state as an expression of advanced political culture, Macedonia remained a land of clans and tribes, held together by the bonds of warriorhood, dynastic bloodlines, and a powerful monarchy, a male-dominated war society that had long since died out in Greece. Greeks mixed wine with cold and warm water. Macedonians, Thracians, and Scythians drank wine neat, leaving Greeks to regard the habit as another barbarian custom. Witches were also common in ancient times, and two of Philip's wives were reputed to be witches. Olympia, Alexander's mother, she was said to be a witch, and Narcissopolis of Thessaly was also supposed to be a witch. Olympia was said to worship snakes and had a habit of taking reptiles to bed with her. And I do believe there was a story, too, that Zeus was a snake, and he had sex with Olympia to make Alexander. So, she snake-fucked Zeus and had Alexander. One more curious and ancient practice was the Macedonian ritual of purifying the army as it set out for war. Priests would cleave a dog in two, and the army was made to walk between the severed halves to purify themselves. And that's pretty fucked up. I like dogs. A man in Macedonia who had not killed a bear single-handedly with a spear and without a net wasn't permitted to recline at the table or eat meat with fellow soldiers. Instead, it was required to sit upright for all to notice. The European bear, by the way, is an aggressive and dangerous animal. To kill one without a net, armed with only a spear, was not a task for the faint-hearted. Macedonians who had not yet killed a man in battle were required to wear a cord around their waists to mark them as unblooded. And as a young man, Philip was required to pass all these tests. His formal education was probably not too different from Alexander's. A personal tutor oversaw literary education and taught Philip to read and write. Music was also a part of his curriculum. In a series of tests of bravery, Philip hunted lions, bears, and leopards with only a spear. He attended the frequent symposia, where he heard tales of Macedonia's history, suffering at the hands of the Illyrians, the Phaeonians, the Mologians, Thracians, the Athenians, the Thebans, the Phocan invaders. That might actually be fucking. I found that as pronounced fucking, but I'm going with Phocan. All right. During his early life, he had witnessed the Athenian and Theban armed interventions, and this no doubt influenced his future decisions and fueled his aggression of Macedonian expansion. Now, let's examine his life and get a good understanding about who Philip was and how he was able to rise and expand Europe's first great empire. I'm not going to bog you down with a lot of Macedonian battle dates and formations. There are going to be a lot of dates, but we're not going to go in great battle detail. As with all topics, there are a lot of layers. We're going to be pulling back quite a bit of those layers right now, but if it isn't enough to satisfy your Macedonian itch, maybe it is enough to inspire you to get pulling back your own layers. I know I learned a lot from this, and I really did enjoy it. This was actually the first subject that I studied for the podcast. Hope you enjoy it too. And for this research, I leaned heavily on Philip II of Macedonia, Greater Than Alexander by Richard A. Gabriel. Philip was the youngest of 3 legitimate sons of King Amyntas III of Macedonia, and his wife, Eurydice, princess of the Lycestian royal house, one of the cantons of Upper Macedonia. And a canton, by the way, is a land boundaries corresponding to territories of the former tribes, like different townships in the same county or similar for the time. Okay, from 393 to 392, and again in 388 BCE, outside forces drove Philip's father from his throne, only to have deposing outside forces assist him in regaining his position. In 382, Illyrians defeated him again and occupied much of Lower Macedonia, taking hostages and tribute. At age 12, Philip's father died, leaving his eldest son, Alexander II, to be king. In an arranged truce between Alexander II and Ptolemy of Archarus, Philip, along with 30 sons of other prominent Macedonian barons, were taken as hostage to Thebes. This was also common in the ancient world. People would keep people's kids. They would keep important people's kids and teach them, but also have them in case a city-state starts to act up again, Alexander II was assassinated while participating in a traditional war dance, Zatica, possibly by a supporter of Ptolemy. The Macedonian assembly selected Perdiccas III, age 15 at the time, as the new king, and Ptolemy was appointed his guardian. 365 BCE, possibly from supplying large quantities of timber to Thebes so they could counter the Athenian fleet, Philip was released and brought back to Macedonia. Immediately after returning, around age 17 or 18, Philip was appointed provincial governor. He's also granted permission to train and raise militia. That's going to undo it for that. Ashed on myself. 359 BCE, Macedonia's army was destroyed. Perdiccas, along with 4,000 men, were killed in battle with the Illyrian king Bartolus. According to Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, it was then Philip was elected king. It's more than likely that Perdiccas' 5-year-old son was appointed king, with Philip being appointed his regent, as explained by Roman historian Marcus Junianus Justinus, but we don't really know for sure about a lot of these old histories. It's just like this is the best we can come up with. I hate to say it that way, but a lot of times that's what it is. All right. Unlike Greek states, which had developed excellent hoplite infantry, Macedonia had no tradition of infantry combat. Macedonian infantry troops were little more than untrained peasants hastily assembled for the occasion and armed with mostly farm implements and work tools. The most important combat arm of the Macedonian armies was the cavalry, comprising the nobility, who provided their own mounts and equipment. Alexander II, Philip's oldest brother, seemed to have made some efforts to create infantry units that were armed and trained similarly to the hoplites of the Greek states. 359 BCE, Macedonia needed an army and needed one quickly. The Illyrians were preparing for another invasion aimed to occupy the entire country. The Phaeonians had begun to assemble their armies along the Axus River for an attack on the lowland plains. Athens had demanded the return of Amphipolis and had assembled an invasion fleet to support the claim of Argeus II, Philip's half-brother, to the Macedonian throne. So there were several reasons to get some kind of fighting force assembled, and on the cheap, considering he was basically paying for all this himself. So how was he supposed to turn an assembly of peasants with little to no military experience and equip and train it quickly in a tactical formation that could hold its own against the hoplite infantry of the Greek states? The answer he devised was the Macedonian phalanx. The original Macedonian phalanx was a simple box, 10 men in front of 10 men, each with a file commanded by a ducadart or a leader of 10 who led their files from the front. These file commanders were the bravest and most experienced troops Philip had available and received double pay for this. The simple square was easy to control, especially in an attack when all it had to do was move forward. The infantry phalanx that Philip invented revolutionized infantry combat in Greece. The Macedonian soldier carried a small 24-inch circular shield made of wood and sometimes covered in bronze. Weighing about 12 pounds, the shield hung over the soldier's chest from a strap around their neck. They wore the same iron helmet the Greek hoplites wore and carried the same siphos or straight double-edged infantry swords. Philip introduced a completely new weapon to Greek warfare, the sarissa. Theophrastus, a contemporary of Philip's, tells us that the sarissa of Philip's day was 12 cubits or some 18 feet long. The phalanx was designed mostly to fend off the enemy long enough for his cavalry to attack the flank or the rear, but the mere sight of the phalanx could be unnerving to the enemy. As long as the Macedonian infantry held their fear in check, the phalanx was impenetrable by the hoplite infantry. In the attack, the phalanx could easily drive through the Greek infantry line. In the defense, its wall of pike points stopped cavalry in its tracks. When Philip took the field against the Illyrians in 358 BCE, just 1 year after the Macedonian army was more or less destroyed, he had raised 10,000 men. This achievement certainly suggests the rapidity in which raw recruits could be trained in this new organizational and tactical system of infantry combat. Philip was a brilliant tactician and relied heavily on the capabilities of the new combat instrument he created. With the invention of the pike phalanx, Philip brought about a technical revolution in Greek warfare, and the real revolutionary aspect of the Macedonian phalanx was his ability to penetrate and paralyze hoplite infantry in ways that made it vulnerable to cavalry attack. Cavalry remained a comparatively minor combat arm in Greece until Philip developed it into the Macedonian army's combat arm of decision. The geography of Greece was largely unsuitable for raising horses, so accordingly little attention was paid in breeding horses and using them for war. Circumstances were different in Macedonia. The large plains and surplus of grain production supported breeding as a majority industry. It wasn't until Philip introduced the pike phalanx in 359 BCE that Macedonian infantry became an important part of the battlefield. While Greece produced excellent infantry and poor cavalry, Macedonia produced excellent cavalry and poor infantry. The Persian army used the horse as a prominent pack animal and a logistics train first, but Philip was the first Western commander to use the horse for this purpose. Philip's greatest contribution to Greek warfare was to organize and train his cavalry units to do what no Greek cavalry had done before, to attack Greek hoplite infantry and destroy them in close contact. Once the enemy infantry line had been pierced, Macedonian cavalry could carry out lethal assaults on the infantry. The primary weapons of the Macedonian cavalrymen were the siston and a murderous meat cleaver called the machaira. The great wealth Philip came to possess allowed him to hire contingents of mercenary troops on what Diodorus tells us was, quote, an unprecedented scale. After the Peloponnesian Wars, Greece was crawling with unemployed, experienced soldiers who sold their skills to various states, tyrants, and kings throughout the Mediterranean, and Philip used them, and he used them often. At times, he held back his own troops and just sent in mercenaries instead to reduce his own losses. 358 to 353 BCE, in just 5 years' time, the military manpower base doubled from 10,000 troops to 20,000, and a year later he had 30,000. Philip's policies exploited the manpower base to create a full-time army of great size, paid and equipped by the king, that could be honed to a fine combat edge by discipline and training. Macedonian officers were not elected officials, but battle-hardened, experienced commanders who held their position after demonstrating competence in war. Diodorus says that Philip, quote, held continuous maneuvers under arms and training exercises under combat conditions, and goes on to say that the degree of training the Macedonian army was unprecedented in the Greek world at the time. Philip was the first Western general to create a permanent engineering corps with siege capability as an integral part of his army. Early on, perhaps before 350 BCE, Philip established a department of military engineering under a talented engineer's direction to research and develop new weapons. The department was established in Pella, where Philip constructed magazines, workshops, and training facilities for his army. Philip's army was designed precisely to project force over great distances, and his political objectives often required the capture and even permanent occupation of enemy cities. He intended in incorporating some cities in the Macedonian state after deporting their native population and replacing them with Macedonian settlers. In the 3 years between 357 and 354, Philip successfully conducted 6 sieges against fortified cities. In less than 12 months, he took Amphipolis, Pydna, and Patadia. 2 years later, he took Methone, Pagasae, and Alinthos. The speed in which these sieges were accomplished was nothing short of amazing by Greek standards. Diodorus' description of Philip's siege in Perinthos in 340 mentions siege towers 120 feet high, battering rams, bolt-shooting artillery, and these were basically catapults, I believe, and scaling ladders. Given Philip's strategic perspective that war was always subordinate to political direction, and that much more could be achieved by politics than by war, it's hardly surprising that Philip became a superb intelligence officer who knew the value of information and how to use it. Philip was a famous and affable host who, through the most expensive parties, was a great conversationalist and gave expensive gifts and honors to many of his friends. And he had hundreds of friends throughout Greece whom he turned into valuable intelligence assets. We hear again and again from sources such as Demosthenes and Theopompus that Philip's successful enslavement of Greece is owed more by treachery on the parts of the Greeks themselves, allowing Philip to purchase their consciences, rather than Philip's own abilities. And on multiple occasions during sieges, cavalry commanders and other men defected to Philip, making their assaults easier to complete. Sometimes these men were caught red-handed, charged with being sent by Philip, and killed. Another of Philip's innovations was the Macedonian Navy, the first national navy force in the country's history. The combination of geography and the Athenians' naval power and history of seaborne invasions forced Philip to develop a naval force in defense. Amphipolis had extensive shipbuilding yards, a seafaring tradition of competent sailors, and proximity to fir and pine forests that were the sources of wood for the ships. Next he seized Pydna, which possessed a fortified harbor and a seagoing population that could be used to man his new ships. By 353, Philip had a small fleet operating from the Thracian coast. The Macedonian navy was no match for the Athenian navy, but Philip would never let it get to that. The Macedonian navy was basically a defensive force tasked with protecting the coastline and preventing hostile landings across the Macedonian army's line of communication. And that was the war machine he himself basically paid for and created. So now we're going to go back to his life specifically. So Philip immediately plunged into the intrigues of court politics of the day. He moved instantly by murdering his half-brother Archelaus. His other two half-brothers were driven into exile, and two additional claimants from a rival branch of the royal family were also killed. The Phaeonians, a people living on the upper reaches of the Axius and Strymon rivers, sensed Macedonian weakness and began raiding the Macedonian lowlands. While Thrace threatened a small Macedonian garrison in Amphipolis, Athens was readying a fleet and an invasion force to land on the Macedonian coast and march to Pella itself. Quote, "These were the perils threatening them," Diodorus says, and the Macedonians were reduced to the greatest despair. Philip needed a break in hostilities to rebuild the army so it could at least handle the threats of Phaeonia and Thrace. To counter the imminent military threats from Illyria and Athens, Philip turned to diplomacy. He opened negotiations with Bartolus, the Illyrian king, and it seems that Philip agreed to formally recognize the Illyrians' occupation in the upper cantons and some Macedonian cities and pay tribute in cash and kind goods. He then moved quickly to defuse the threat from Athens. Unable to come to any sort of agreement, Philip knew a military confrontation with Athens would be a certainty. Diodorus tells us, next he opened up negotiations with the Phaeonians, and having corrupt some with bribes and others with generous promises, he made an agreement to remain at peace. In a few short months, Philip had achieved what might have first appeared impossible. Without the means to protect Macedonia by force, Philip relied on diplomacy to reduce the dangers facing his country. In this way, he had delayed an invasion by Illyria, and he had discovered and neutralized several plots to remove him. Gifts, bribes, and promises purchased temporary peace from the Phaeonians and ended their raids. Under the cover of night, Philip marched his new army from Pella to the Lavadi Ridge, and knowing the Athenian commander Mantius had no cavalry, Philip planned accordingly. Diodorus tells us that Philip's plan worked perfectly. No one knew it then, but warfare in Greece would never be the same. Philip used his victory as an opening to seek a diplomatic solution to the problem and offered lenient terms for those he had captured. He sent a letter proposing a peace with Athens in return for renouncing his claim to Amphipolis. Athens accepted the proposal. In October 358, Cineas, the head of the powerful Aleuadea family who ruled Larissa, requested Philip to intervene in his quarrel with the tyrants of Pherae and Thessaly. His intervention at the request of Larissa was an important diplomatic achievement for Macedonia, for it established Philip as a legitimate player in Thessalian politics, and one whom the cities of the Thessalian League could turn for advice. To demonstrate his sincere commitment to Thessaly, Philip married a Thessalian girl, Paulina of Larissa. She was the mother of Aridaeus, Philip's first son. I'm actually going to smoke another one of these. Pop it back open. All right, according to Theopompus and Demosthenes, a secret pact was struck with Philip. After taking Amphipolis, he promised to turn it over to Athens in return for Pydna. In the autumn of 357 BCE, Philip straightway reduced Pydna. The Athenians waited for Philip to turn Amphipolis over to them, and it would be a long time. 357 is also the year Philip met and married Olympias to cement an alliance between Macedon and Epirus. In 3 years, Philip unified Macedonia. He inflicted crushing defeats on the Illyrians and Phaeonians. He put down 2 attempts by his rivals to depose him, freed the Macedonian coast of all but one of its foreign bases, captured the fortress of Amphipolis, destroyed the Athenian naval base in Phytadia, neutralized the Chalcadian threat, driven Athenian influence from the Thermaic Gulf, and pushed into Thrace, extending Macedonian power east of the Nestus River, incorporating the upper cantons, and doubled the size and population of Philip's kingdom. And in July of 356, Olympias presented Philip with a son. Philip named him Alexander. Philip's interest in Thessaly was heightened in 356 when Phocas occupied the sacred shrine of Delphi and seized the temple's treasure. An Athenian army might come overland through Thessaly or by sea. If by sea, it would likely use the city of Methone, its remaining ally on the nearby Macedonian coast, as a place for its invasion force to come ashore. Diodorus tells us when Philip saw the inhabitants of Methone were offering the city as a base for his enemies, he initiated a siege. Sometime in the fall of 355, Philip attacked Methone. And this would be the battle where Philip was wounded in the eye. Diodorus tells us that for some time the Methones endured the siege, but were eventually overcome and compelled to surrender their city to the king on the condition they would depart Methone with one garment apiece. It is interesting to note that the city surrendered and was apparently taken without violence. Marcus Junianus Justinus describes Philip's mood after recovering from his wound in Methone. The wound did not make him slower in war or angrier with his enemies, so much so that a few days later he granted them peace at their request, and was not only restrained but mild to the vanquished. A fucking arrow in his eye. That sounds terrible. Alright, let's talk a minute about Philip's battle wounds. In Philip's world, officers led from the front and risked their lives with their men. From all accounts, Philip was a remarkably brave man who suffered at least 5 serious wounds in combat. His wounds left him in constant pain, and alcohol likely reduced his suffering. It does not appear that he became the alcoholic Alexander became. Philip received his first battle wound in 354 at the siege of Methone. A sniper on the city wall shot an arrow into Philip's right eye while he was inspecting sheds used to protect siege machinery. He was wounded again in 345 during his campaign against the Illyrians. A soldier named Pausanias covered Philip as he lay on the ground and shielded him from further blows, saving the king but dying in the process. And we're going to hear about a few Pausaniases in this story. Must have been a common name, like, I don't know, Kale today. His army had a 20% casualty loss in that battle. Philip suffered a broken collarbone and his lower leg bones were smashed. It's likely the latter wound that made Philip lame for the rest of his life. So he had a bit of a limp. In 339 BCE, Philip was wounded again after a successful campaign. While returning back to Macedonia, he was basically jumped by a warrior people, the Tribali. When Philip refused to give up any booty, they took most of his prisoners and left Philip so severely wounded that officers thought he was dead. Didymus tells us that Philip was struck in the leg by a lance and his head was mutilated, most likely by a horse falling on him. Jeez. I'm sure he had a lot more wounds in his lifetime, but these are the ones I have recorded instances of. So back to Philip. 354 to 353 BCE, he undertook an expedition into Thrace. Accompanied by his naval force, the first operational test of his new navy, Philip pressed east beyond the Nestus into Amadicus's kingdom of Middle Thrace. After this, his troops were ambushed and defeated into retreat by Anomachus on behalf of Lysiphron, the tyrant of Pherae, on the grounds of Philip being a significant threat against the Pherae-Phocian alliance. Philip is supposed to have remarked about the ambush, "I did not run, but like a ram I pulled back to butt again." All right, hard guy. In the spring of 352, Philip and the Macedonian army marched into Thessaly and made straight for the city of Pherae. Philip took Pherae, its tyrant Lysiphron, and his 2,000 defenders under siege. Philip's reconnaissance picked up Anomachus as soon as he entered Thessaly. Philip was aware of Anomachus's progress and position at any given time, and he knew he had the advantage in cavalry due to his reconnaissance, discovering the strength of the Phocian force. As night fell, Philip assembled his army under the cover of darkness for the 8-mile march to Crocus Field. Anomachus found himself facing the best infantry in Greece and must have known that he was doomed. Trapped between the Macedonian pikemen in the front and the Machaera-wielding cavalry in their backs, the Phocian infantrymen were stabbed and hacked to pieces. The battle couldn't have lasted long, perhaps only an hour or so. In the end, 6,000 Phocian soldiers were killed, and another 3,000 were taken prisoner. Anomachus's fate is unclear, but in all likelihood he perished on the battlefield and then his corpse was crucified. On Philip's orders, 3,000 prisoners were put to death by drowning. And holy shit, I wonder if it was 3,000 at one time, or just a few at a time, or 100 at a time. Either way, this shit sounds terrible. Philip was now regarded as the savior. who suppressed the Pharian tyranny and rescued the Thessalian League, something the League alone was unable to do. In an event that was completely without precedent in Greece, a foreign king was chosen by free election and without compulsion or intimidation to be archon, or ruler of the League of Greek cities. What made Philip's election even more astonishing is that the office was conferred for life. Not only was it Philip's greatest diplomatic victory, it also changed the history of Greece. For all practical purposes, Philip's election as archon made Thessaly a part of the Macedonian kingdom. It will remain so for the next 150 years. After returning from Thessaly, Philip turned his attention to Thrace. After his defeat, the Athenians sought to take advantage of Philip's weakened position and take control of Thrace, fighting several battles and capturing numerous towns and cities. In July or August of 351, with the campaign completed, Philip fell seriously ill but recovered. Philip had been concerned with the Linthos and the 32 cities of the Chalcadian League that it led from the beginning of his reign. Its strategic geographic location at the head of the Thermaic Gulf, its economic power and large population, and its considerable military force constituted a potentially serious threat to Macedonian security. Olynthos had openly been in contact with Athens since 353 and already concluded a peace treaty with Athens to repair relations strained by Philip's siege in Amphipolis. Olynthos' treaty with Philip prohibited such a deal and would have been a great concern of Philip. Theopompus is probably correct that Philip delivered a stern warning to the city's leaders while the Macedonian army was encamped close by. As he had done often, Philip used his diplomatic skills to deal with Olynthos by reminding leaders in serious tones of their treaty obligations, but taking no further action. The discussion seemed to have had some effect, and the Olynthians expelled Apollonides from the city. He was the leader of the anti-Macedonian faction. In the spring of 349, Philip demanded Olynthos surrender his half-brother to him. Olynthos refused, and in midsummer, Philip attacked Chalcidice. Philip moved against the Chalcadians to prevent an alliance. After arriving at Chalcidice, Philip's engineers went about their work and the city fell in a relatively short time. Philip's policy of striking terror in the hearts of the League cities paid quick dividends, and a number of small towns surrendered without a fight to save themselves. Philip's strategy was succeeding handsomely when events forced him to abandon his campaign and return to Thessaly in late fall. Pherae had broken into open revolt, perhaps by a deposed tyrant, Pytalaus. While Philip was in Thessaly suppressing the Pheraean revolt, another revolt broke out in the island of Euboea in February 348 that greatly concerned Athens. The island was of vital strategic importance to Athens. If Philip could reach the northern end of Euboea by sea, he could then march down the island, cross into Boeotia, link up with the Theban and Boeotian allies, and attack Athens itself. In the spring of 348 BCE, Philip was campaigning against the western cities and much closer to Olynthos. He took Apollonia and Torone. By summer, Macimberna fell to the Macedonians, greatly reducing Olynthos' ability to receive reinforcements by Athens. By June, Philip was outside its walls preparing to bring Olynthos under siege. Philip had timed the final assault on Olynthos to coincide with the season of Etesian winds. The transports carrying the Athenian relief force were unable to be put to sea for 40 days. Olynthos sent a messenger asking Philip for terms. Philip had no intention on coming to terms. Philip's reply reflected his contempt for Olynthos. For the rest of time, it is not possible for you to live in Olynthos and me in Macedonia. His only solution was to destroy Olynthos and annex the entire Chalcidian peninsula. The siege began in July, and by September 348 it was over. The once powerful city of 10,000 ceased to exist. Because Olynthos had betrayed him, Philip turned the city over to his army, which went on a bloody rampage, killing the civilian population indiscriminately. He distributed Olynthian lands to his companions and other important persons, distributed cash gifts to important men in other Chalcidice cities, and in this way secured the services of many men willing to betray their city. Philip intended to integrate the whole Chalcidice into Macedonia. He had taken first steps towards a negotiation peace with Athens immediately after his capture of Olynthos. If Philip wished to do so, he could easily have forced the now only lightly defended pass at Thermopylae, joined with Thebes, and defeated Phocis, bringing an end to the sacred war. But he had no desire to end the war as long as it continued to weaken all major Greek states except Macedonia. That summer, Macedonian privateers had captured an Athenian citizen named Phrynon and held him for ransom. Athens sent an embassy to Philip demanding the man's release. Philip agreed that the seizure was illegal and the man was released. Philip then sent back a message with the Athenian emissary that the king regretted the war on Athens and that he had been forced into it, and that now he wanted to end it and conclude peace with Athens. As always, Philip was trying to obtain with diplomacy what he had not yet achieved by war. In 346, Philip made another attempt to settle things diplomatically. The fate of the Athenians captured by Philip at Olynthos and being held prisoner was an emotional issue for Athens. In early 346, the Athenian assembly sent Aristodemus, an actor and old friend of Philip's, to Pella to determine what Philip intended to do with the prisoners. Empty-handed, Aristodemus returned with the news that Philip wanted peace and an alliance with Athens. This time, Athens was in no position to refuse. As a sign of good faith, Philip offered two things: to release the Athenian prisoners immediately and without ransom, and to recognize Athenian influence in Euboea. He also promised not to attack the Athenian position in the Chersonese as long as the negotiations were in progress. While Philip was campaigning in Thrace, the Athenian delegation had returned to Athens and begun debating Philip's terms for peace and alliance with Macedonia. Athens was isolated, exhausted, broke, and easy prey for the Macedonian king. A few days later, the Athenian assembly agreed to the peace of Philocrates. Philocrates was a member of the delegation to Pella and a prominent in the peace with Philip. The Athenians had come to Pella to conclude to all sides a bilateral agreement, only to find themselves in the middle of a larger negotiation, addressing how Philip intended to settle the sacred war. Philip listened carefully and led each to believe that he supported its position. The Athenians were eager for peace, and after negotiations concluded, Philip marched his army south towards the Thermopylae Pass to surprise the Phocians, who had been misled by Philip's promises that he intended to settle the sacred war peacefully. More than likely, a deal had already been agreed upon, because when Philip arrived with his army, Philacus immediately surrendered Thermopylae to Philip without a fight. Philip's army poured through the pass and occupied the fortress towns. All of Greece from Attica to the Peloponnese was now at risk of Macedonian attack. Philip's seizure of the Thermopylae Pass was more a victory of diplomacy and intelligence than of arms. Macedonia's emergence as a major power was possible in large part because the most important Greek states were busy fighting each other, while Philip expanded Macedonia's power at its periphery. When eventually Philip was ready to strike at the center of Greece, no state or combination of states was left to stop him. Philip and the Macedonian army were now less than 30 miles from Elete, with no substantial enemy forces between them and the Phocian capital. To the southeast, Thebes and the armies of the Boeotian League were preparing to move north. Phocis was now trapped in a vice by two major armies without any prospect of aid. The Phocians surrendered to Philip in June 346. The Amphictyonic League's delegates resolved to destroy all the Phocian cities, and Pausanias names 20 cities who suffered this fate. The League decreed that Philip and his descendants should be members of the League and should have 2 votes, which formerly belonged to the Phocians, combined with 6 Thessalian votes. Philip now had a virtual majority over the League's decisions. Philip took great effort to always appear to be operating within the context of the League and not as the king of Macedonia, that is, furthering the alliance's interests first and not those of his own country. When Philip finally proposed an alliance and a truce with the Athenians in early 348, Athens was already on its last leg. By the end of the Sacred War, Philip had weakened the Athenians' hold on Euboea, driven it from the Chalcidice and the Thermaic Gulf, seized and occupied the Thermopylae Pass, and reduced much of Thrace to a Macedonian satellite from which he was able to attack eastern Thrace and the Chersonese. Athenian power had been so successfully reduced that Athens could no longer serve as an effective check on Thebes or Sparta. Having allied Athens with Macedonia, Philip now aimed to reduce Theban and Spartan power in the central Greece region. It was in 346 that Philip may have begun contemplating an invasion of Persia. Diodorus tells us that after he had arranged the Amphictyonic peace, Philip returned to Pella, where he was eager to be nominated commander-in-chief of the Greeks with full powers and to conduct war with the Persians. If Philip was seeking glory and wealth, then an invasion of Persia made the most sense. Differences between the Athenians and Philip, however, dissolved their partnership. The following spring, 345, Philip took his army into Illyria to deal with the growing threat of the rebellion from the Dardarians and the Ardrai, possibly. Philip broke the Illyrian rebellion, and after pillaging the land and securing many of the townships, he returned to Macedonia with large quantities of booty. For most of Philip's reign, the Persians had been distracted by internal problems. By 340 BCE, Persia had succeeded in establishing control of Egypt, Cyprus, and Phoenicia, and remained on good terms with the Greek cities in coastal Asia, gaining access to their fleets. Athens' failure to secure Persian aid removed the last restraint on Philip, and that summer Philip prepared war on Athens. He concluded that a genuine peace was no longer possible. Without getting too in-depth with dates and specific battles, the Macedonians fought many battles in the Chersonese, Perinthus, Byzantium, Athens, Scythia, and finally Chaeronea. This is also the time when Alexander began commanding on his own, achieving several key victories with his father. All great battles are fought for political goals, the armies being but means to larger ends. Chaeronea was a great battle precisely because it allowed Philip to finally achieve his most important political and strategic objective of unifying Greece under Macedonian hegemony. It is impossible to imagine Greek history from this forward without Philip's victory at Chaeronea. Out of respect for the Athenians, Philip gave the bodies of the slain for burial, had them cremated, and had an honored guard carry their ashes to Athens, and this guard was Alexander, Antipater, and Alcimachus. Philip also freed Athenian prisoners of war without ransom. The Athenians were so relieved that they raised a statue of Philip in the Agora. Philip's treatment of Thebes stands in marked contrast to his treatment of Athens. He allowed them to rot in the sun for several days, repeatedly denied Theban requests to recover their slain, and when Philip finally allowed them to do so, he charged ransom for the Theban prisoners and corpses as well. He did treat the sacred band with respect. Otherwise, he treated the Thebes and its soldiers with undisguised contempt, as befitting a treacherous ally that had broken a solemn oath or treaty. Macedonia was now a preeminent power in Greece, and Philip intended to use this power to guarantee Macedonian power for the foreseeable future and establish the necessary conditions to carry out a successful invasion of Persia. In the weeks following Chaeronea, Philip began establishing the new order by concluding bilateral agreements with the major Greek states. Unlike Athens, Philip had no interest in preserving Theban power. He set out to reduce Theban authority and regional influence permanently. Philip killed the chief men in the city. Others he banished and seized the others' property. Philip now turned his attention to Sparta, the most powerful state in the Peloponnesus. Sparta had not joined the Athenian League or taken any hostile action against Philip, yet Philip could hardly have permitted Sparta to maintain its position in the region if he were going to impose a common peace on Greece. To do so might invite the Persians to try and entice Sparta against Philip. When he left for Asia, Philip marched into Argos and offered to negotiate with Sparta, and when they refused, Philip marched in Laconia with the Macedonian army in the autumn of 338 and laid the region to waste. Philip did not attempt to destroy the Spartan state. The objective was to weaken Spartan relative to its smaller neighbors and prevent its dominance of the region. He succeeded. In late 338, Philip issued more an order than invitation for the city-states to send representatives to a conference in Corinth. Philip aimed to create a common peace for all Greece. Justinus tells us that Philip was courteous to the delegates and listened to their concerns, and there was a wide agreement that they should end the revolutionary strife and warfare that plagued Greece. In the spring of 337, the delegates returned to Corinth for another meeting and voted to approve Philip's plan. The council authorized the creation of a common armed force drawn for each member's military forces in proportionate numbers to enforce its edicts. Philip was elected its hegemon. In this way, Philip imposed a common peace on Greece, creating a community of Greeks in what modern scholars came to call the League of Corinth. As hegemon, Philip was also strategos autokrator, or commander-in-chief with full powers, who could call upon the League's forces to use against any member state that violated obligations or to meet any foreign threat. Philip produced a community of Greeks by making the various peoples live within a collective constitutional order with common laws and obligations supported by effective administrative and enforcement mechanisms, including means to defend itself from internal and external threats. Federal leagues of city-states have been attempted before in Greece, but none with the scope of Philip's League of Corinth. In the autumn of 337, the council was again called into session to hear Philip's proposal to invade Persia and punish the Persians for the acts of sacrilege they had committed against Greek sanctuaries. Philip had technically been at war with Persia since the siege of Perinthus in 340, when Persia had sent supplies to Perinthus and military forces onto Thrace. In the spring of 336, Philip sent an advance expeditionary force of 10,000 men, Macedonian troops, into Asia Minor. A year earlier, in the spring of 337, Philip acquired another wife, the Macedonian woman named Cleopatra, the ward of a powerful baron named Attalus. After the wedding feast, the males gathered in a typical Macedonian drinking bout. And this is when the famous story of Philip attempting to attack Alexander, only to stumble on the floor, happens. I don't know if you guys have heard about that, but he was drunk, and then Alexander said some shit, and he said some shit, and then he got up and tried to attack him. And he was so drunk he stumbled, and that's basically what happened. Everybody laughed. Anyway, afterwards, Alexander and Olympia left for Illyria, and upon sober reflection, Philip realized the damage he had done and moved to reconcile with Olympias and Alexander. The day after his marriage ceremony, Philip was to preside over the athletic games. A grand procession would take place beforehand in the Theater of Aegae. The procession began at sunrise with statues of 12 Olympian gods carried into the theater. A statue of Philip was carried in close behind. Then, according to Diodorus, came Alexander the heir and Alexander of Epirus walking ahead of Philip. And Philip himself entered wearing a white cloak. He ordered his bodyguards to follow and be removed at some distance from him, as an indication to everyone that he needed no protection from his guards. Such was the degree of the preeminence he had attained. When Philip reached the center of the theater, he stopped and faced the cheering crowd. Suddenly, a figure rushed forward and stabbed Philip in the chest, driving the blow right through his ribs, and laid him out prostrate and lifeless. Philip's blood soaked his white cloak red. The king's bodyguards rushed to his side, but Philip died almost immediately. The assassin sprinted to the gates to the horses, and he made ready for his escape. Diodorus notes the assassin had a head start in pursuit, and would have succeeded in mounting his horse before they could stop him, had he not entangled his freaking sandal in a vine and fallen. Those damn sandals. I guess he should have went barefoot. As he was getting up from the ground, Perdiccas and the soldiers seized him, ran him through, and killed him. Such was the end of Philip. In the course of a reign of 20 years, he had been the greatest of the kings of Europe of his day. And that is more or less the Cliff's version of Philip II of Macedonia. So, who killed him? The sources of Philip's assassination are generally poor, because none of them could have known whether anyone else was involved in the scheme. All the sources do agree that the assassin's identity, it was Pausanias of Orestes, a canton of Upper Macedonia. Pausanias was able to get close to Philip to strike him down because Pausanias had been recently appointed one of Philip's bodyguards. Diodorus tells us that Philip had promoted Pausanias himself. Thus Philip had put his own assassin in a position to kill him. Why did Pausanias kill Philip? According to all three sources, the motive was personal anger and revenge because Philip allowed him to be outrageously treated by Attalus and company. Diodorus and Justinus tell us the outrage involved Pausanias' rape by Attalus and his cronies, who then turned Pausanias over to his muleteers for further abuse. When Pausanias was a page, Philip had been attracted to him because of his good looks, and they had engaged in a homosexual affair. After some time, Philip was attracted to another page who had the same name, and he abandoned this Pausanias. He took the new Pausanias. He liked that new Pausanias thing. It's said that Attalus lured Pausanias to his house, where, after filling him with vast quantities of unmixed wine, Attalus handed his body over to his stablemen to abuse him sexually in drunken rape. Pausanias was enraged, obviously, at the assault and appealed to his former lover Philip to punish Attalus. While Philip was angry at the enormity of the crime, he refused to punish Attalus because of kinship. Attalus had adopted Philip's new wife Cleopatra and was therefore Philip's new father-in-law. He also had already chosen Attalus to command the advance expedition to Persia. Philip tried to appease Pausanias, and that was when he promoted him to a more honorable position amongst his bodyguards. Aristotle tells us the same story of Attalus and his henchmen. Seething with anger, Pausanias killed Philip for not punishing Attalus and avenging him. That Pausanias killed Philip is beyond doubt. Whether the assassination was part of a larger conspiracy has intrigued historians ever since. The usual suspects are Olympia, Alexander, some or all the sons of Aripus, of Lycestis, Amyntas, and the Persian king Darius. Immediately following the assassination, the Macedonians from Aegae and the surrounding regions were summoned to the assembly under arms to elect a new king. Antipater presented Alexander to the assembly, which then elected Alexander as the new king. And that is where we're going to stop this examination into the life of Philip II of Macedon. Philip was a hard dude in a hard time, living in a hard world, but he endured and kept moving forward, turning Macedonia from near extinction basically to the most powerful, wealthiest state in Greece. He killed a bunch of dudes, but dudes that would have done the same to him if they had the chance. Why was he killed? No one knows for sure. But if I were gang raped by your father-in-law and a bunch of his friends, then thrown outside for other soldiers to have their way with me, that would be more than enough to entice me to do some crazy-ass shit. But who knows? Maybe it was Olympias or his son Alexander. He was ahead of his time and a product of his time. In a lot of ways, we just barely scratched the surface of what he accomplished. Since his early 20s, the only year he was not campaigning was 344 BCE, and that was because he almost died the previous year. There were a lot of dates on this one, but he was a genius war tactician, which is a lot of what he's known for today, and we didn't even cover much or really any of his battle strategies. Alexander was no rags to riches. Philip was. Alexander was more a Michael Douglas or Howard Hughes, both very accomplished on a professional level, inspiring, but Philip was Genghis Khan or Brad Pitt. And that's what we have for you guys today. Thanks for tuning in. If you have something to say, leave us a comment or send an email to stonedatepod@gmail.com. Follow us on Facebook at the Stone Date Podcast with Wes Ranson, or on YouTube, youtube.com/@thestonedatepod, and we'll have links for these down below. Thanks again, and have a chill day.